What happens when a society can't tell the difference between a curse and a contagion? The Plague of Eldara wasn't a single event. It was a cascade, beginning in the harbor district of Vithara in the year 412 of the Third Reckoning, and spreading inland along every major trade road within 40 days. The journals describe a disease with 3 distinct stages: fever and trembling first, then the blackening of surface veins, and finally a silver clouding of the eyes that chroniclers called the veil. The veil meant death within 3 days. Vithara was Eldara's wealthiest port. 12 merchant guilds operated there. Ships arrived from 6 coastal nations every week. It was, in every sense, the perfect origin point for an outbreak that no border could stop. The journals weren't written by one person. At least 7 distinct authors contributed across 3 years: physicians, priests, and survivors, each recording what they witnessed through their own framework of understanding. The physician authors were methodical. They recorded patient counts, symptom timelines, and treatment outcomes, tracking which interventions reduced fever duration and which accelerated progression to the veil. These are epidemiological field records, structured, systematic, and deeply uncomfortable reading. The priest authors reached a different conclusion. They identified the plague as divine punishment, specifically retribution for the Vithara Guild's practice of trading with the Ashen Kingdoms, nations the faith of Eldara considered spiritually contaminated. Here is where the journals earn their weight. Both frameworks, scientific and supernatural, were operating at the same time. Both were generating real policy responses. The question isn't which was right. The question is which caused more harm. The physician Marin of Caldwick, writing in year 413, recommended what she called the sealed road policy, closing all trade routes into Vithara and establishing monitored camps for the exposed. It was, functionally, a quarantine. The High Cantor of the Eldaran faith, Seveth Dorn, recommended something entirely different. He called for the public burning of all trade goods from the Ashen Kingdoms and the formal exile of any merchant family with documented Ashen ancestry. Dorn's exile decree created the concept of the cursed bloodline, the idea that Ashen heritage itself was the vector of disease. 17 merchant families were formally registered. Their assets were seized. Their children were barred from guild apprenticeships. The plague didn't stop. Dorn's exile decree was issued in month 7 of year 413. By month 9, new outbreaks had appeared in Caldwick, Thornvast, and the inland city of Ruin, none of which had significant Ashen trade connections. Marin's third journal entry, the one that changed everything, documented a pattern. Every new inland outbreak was centered on a shared well or cistern fed by a Vethara-adjacent river tributary. The disease was waterborne. This is the tension at the heart of the Eldara journals. Marin had the right answer by year 413. The mechanism was documented. The evidence was there. And yet, the cursed bloodline doctrine had already taken hold, politically, spiritually, and legally. The Eldaran Council of Rectors met 3 times to consider Marin's waterborne findings. Each time, Dorn's faction blocked formal adoption of the sealed road policy on theological grounds. The meetings are documented. The obstruction is documented. The deaths that followed are documented. The mortality registers from year 414 show the consequence directly. The death toll in settlements that adopted Marin's water protocols was 40 per thousand. In settlements that followed Dorn's exile policy exclusively, it was 230 per thousand. Here is where the mythology becomes instructive. The cursed bloodline concept wasn't random cruelty. It was a misread signal. Ashen-descended families did cluster near the original outbreak because they lived closest to the harbor district's water infrastructure. Proximity to contaminated water was the actual variable. Ancestry was a false correlation, a pattern that looked meaningful because of where those families had been settled by the Thara's guild housing policies decades before the plague arrived. One of the 7 journal authors, unnamed, writing in year 415, asked the question directly: why did the correct explanation take 2 years to act upon? Their answer names the mechanism plainly. The framework that offered a culprit moved faster than the framework that required digging up streets. The unnamed author concluded that Dorn's framework was adopted faster, not because it was more convincing, but because it was more actionable. It named a cause, it named a culprit, it offered a ritual response. Marin's framework demanded infrastructure work, slow, expensive, unglamorous. By year 415, 7 major settlements had independently adopted well sealing and water diversion protocols based on Marin's documentation. Not because the council approved it, they hadn't. Local administrators read the mortality registers, compared 40 per thousand against 230, and made the calculation themselves. No theological consensus required. The plague's retreat followed the map of practical intervention almost exactly. Settlements with sealed wells saw outbreak rates collapse within 60 days. The correlation was so stark that even Dorn's faction couldn't argue against it by year 416. In year 416, the Council of Rectors issued the Recantation of Vethera, formally withdrawing the cursed bloodline designation and restoring guild rights to the 17 exiled families. Dorn's name doesn't appear on the document. He had died of the plague in year 415. The recantation came too late for many. The journals specifically document the Veth Oren family, one of the 17 registered, whose 3 apprentice children died in an exile camp in year 414, 1 year before the council even debated the waterborne evidence. Their family compound in Vethara's Harbor District was sold at state auction. The legal restoration of year 416 returned neither the children nor the property. The Plague of Eldara didn't simply end. It restructured Eldara. The guild system that had made Vethera wealthy was dismantled and rebuilt under state oversight. New water infrastructure codes were written into the Rector's Charter. The outbreak became foundational law. The 7 journals survived because a Thornvast archivist named Sola Bren bound them together in year 420 with a single purpose, so the next generation wouldn't have to relearn what this one had paid for in blood. There's one specific gap in the recantation of Vethara that the journals flagged directly. The document names all 17 exiled families and restores their guild standing. But the Ashen Kingdoms, the nations whose diaspora was designated the source of spiritual contamination, appear nowhere in the withdrawal. The accusation was made publicly. The retraction was made only domestically. What the Plague of Eldara produced was institutional memory encoded directly into law and stone. The Rector's Charter mandated stone-lined wells, separated drainage channels, and quarterly inspections, requirements that applied to every settlement in the realm, not just those that had suffered outbreaks. When the next major disease event arrived in year 489, Eldara's water infrastructure was already in place. Containment took 11 days. In year 412, that infrastructure didn't exist, and the outbreak ran for 3 years. 11 days versus 3 years. That gap isn't explained by luck or a weaker pathogen. It's explained entirely by the infrastructure Marin's work made possible, and by the institutional willingness to deploy it without waiting for theological consensus. Someone, we don't know who, returned to Marin's 3rd journal entry decades later and wrote a single annotation in the margin. It reads, "This was correct from the 1st month." 4 words, the weight of every preventable death in them. The Eldaron data makes the structural lesson concrete. Settlements that acted on Marin's water protocols in year 415 saw mortality drop from 230 per thousand to 40. The year 489 outbreak was contained in 11 days because those protocols had been written into the rector's charter as mandatory law, not voluntary guidance. The difference between a catastrophe and a contained event wasn't knowledge. Marin had the knowledge in year 413. The difference was whether that knowledge had been encoded into infrastructure before the next crisis arrived. The Plague of Eldara's real lesson isn't about blame. It's about the gap between knowing and building. Marin's diagnosis was correct in year 413. The infrastructure that saved lives in year 489 was built in year 416. That 3-year gap between correct knowledge and encoded action is where the preventable deaths lived. The question worth carrying forward isn't whether your society has the right answer. It's whether the right answer has been built into the systems that will still be running when the next crisis arrives.